It began as a dare, a foolish challenge thrown at Amir in the middle of a late-night livestream where his chat had erupted with laughing emojis and blood-dripping skull gifs after someone mentioned the legend of the Forest of the Damned, a place so cursed that even animals refused to enter, where shadows were said to bleed, and where, buried beneath moss and rot, lay an ancient skull carved with a single open eye that stared not at the world, but threw a hand into the soul of the one who touched it. Amir, ever the showman, ever the thrill-hungry streamer, desperate to keep his growing channel alive in the sea of content creators, grinned and accepted the challenge without hesitation, confident that he would uncover the supposed artifact, wave it around for a few viral clips, and emerge richer in views and adrenaline, mocking the superstitions as nothing more than the ghost stories of backwoods weirdos. But as the sun set behind him and the trees swallowed the sky in their black canopy, as the last signal bar on his phone died and the forest seemed to inhale around him, pulling the air tighter, denser, heavier with each step, Amir felt the kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of noise, but from something holding its breath, watching, waiting. And despite his bravado and the comments scrolling rapidly across his screen, "This guy is nuts. Bro's gonna get possessed, FRF." He began to sense the weight of something ancient pushing against him, a presence that didn't like being disturbed. Still, he pressed on, flashlight flickering over twisted roots and bark that looked like claw marks, until he found the altar, if it could be called that, a low stone platform half swallowed by earth and vines. And there it was, the skull, pale and cracked, missing its lower jaw but unmistakably human, except for the grotesque addition carved into its forehead and eye, disturbingly lifelike, surrounded by inked lashes and veins that curled like smoke into the bone. And though Amir tried to laugh, tried to play it cool for the stream, something in him recoiled as his fingers brushed it, the bone freezing cold, despite the muggy night, and in that moment, he felt something snap, not in the skull, but in the forest itself, as though a lock had turned, or a seal broken, because the trees seemed to sigh, the wind died entirely, and somewhere far off, a bell rang once, deep and hollow. He lifted the skull toward the camera, heart pounding, but the moment it came into frame, the screen glitched, the lights dimmed, and his audio crackled with static, followed by something that made every hair on his body stand, a whisper, not in his ears but inside his head, a wet, gurgling voice that said, "You see now." From the shadows behind him, something stirred, and as Amir spun around, he saw her for the first time, tall and impossibly still, dressed in the tattered remains of a nun's habit. Her face cracked like dry earth, eyes black pits ringed with bleeding irises, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream as she drifted forward, arms outstretched like a marionette cut free from its strings. Amir stumbled backward, breath gone, but worse was what came next, another shape. Further back, barely visible through the mist, now coiling between the trees, a hooded figure with a scythe dragging in the dirt, its blade ringing softly against every root and stone, and though it moved slowly, Amir felt with dreadful certainty that it would never stop, that it would follow him until he either died or surrendered. And when he turned to run, he found the forest no longer followed logic, trails looping into themselves, landmarks disappearing, the altar appearing again and again, no matter which direction he ran, like a nightmare with no exit, his lungs burning and the skull still clutched tight in his hand, fused almost, for he could no longer feel his fingers beneath it. His livestream flickered in and out, sometimes showing his face distorted, other times filled with symbols he couldn't read, runic spirals, weeping eyes, and once, his own reflection hanging upside down like a corpse from a tree. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, maybe days, until he stumbled into a clearing where an old stone chapel leaned drunkenly beneath the weight of centuries, half its walls fallen, its steeple split by lightning, and inside, scrawled across the walls in dried blood and soot, were the words, "She watches, he waits," again and again, along with a journal bound in rotting leather, its pages the confessions of Sister Helena, a nun who once lived in this forest and whose entries grew increasingly disturbed as she spoke of visions, rituals, and a cursed object buried to contain an evil that should never be awakened. Amir, read on, hands trembling, learning that Helena had participated in a forbidden rite meant to seal a demon known only as the Watcher into a vessel made from the bones of a prophet who gouged out his own eyes to escape the vision sent by God. But the ritual failed, and the nun was cursed to serve the skull in death, her soul trapped in the forest, bound to ensure the skull remained untouched. And now, with Amir's intrusion, the seal had broken. The Watcher was waking, and, worse, it had already begun to feed on him. Each moment he held the skull, a thread in his sanity snapping. He dropped the journal as the chapel darkened, the air thick with 1,000 whispers not meant for human ears. And behind him, the nun waited once more, her face closer now, her breath icy, and when she spoke, her voice was Amir's own, repeating his childhood fears, his regrets, his sins, all pouring into his ears as the hooded reaper stepped into the chapel and raised its scythe not to strike. but to point, and, when Amir looked in the direction it gestured, he saw a mirror, cracked, and hanging on the chapel wall, but the reflection didn't show him. It showed the skull, embedded in his face, the eye wide open and moving, scanning the room, and Amir screamed, not from fear but from the realization that he had already changed, that the forest had been feeding on him from the moment he stepped into it, reshaping his mind, rewriting his memories, and that every step he took had already happened before. That this wasn't the first time he had held the Skolno. The stream was a loop, a bait, a trap cast out to the world, drawing and thrill-seeking unbelievers, skeptics, and each time they touched the skull, the nun grew stronger, the forest expanded, and the watcher's eye opened a little wider. He ran again, though there was nowhere left to run, his scream swallowed by the trees as they bent and twisted into faces, hundreds of them, screaming in unison, echoing his name, Amir, 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 until at last he stumbled and fell into darkness, waking again at the forest's edge with a dead phone, a memory full of holes, and a skull in his hand again. Always again, again, always again. And though Amir didn't know how many times he had awoken at the forest's edge thinking this was the first, some deeper, decaying part of him did. Some raw nerve of consciousness buried beneath rotting layers of illusion screamed silently each time he laughed into the camera and shouted, "Let's do this," to a chat room that no longer truly existed, each time he followed the path to the altar with the skull already calling his name. Each time the nun and the reaper waited in the wings of the trees, like actors trapped in a cursed play, doomed to repeat their parts for all eternity, but this time, something was different. This time, after he clutched the skull and the world bled static, he felt something resisting inside him, like the last ember of a self that hadn't yet been extinguished. A flicker of rebellion in the storm of madness, and it whispered, "So he did." Fragments at first, out of sequence memories of previous loops, broken images of the chapel, the journal, the reaper's pointing hand, his own reflection with the third eye wide and wet and searching, and the whispers that once drove him mad, now clarified into voices, and the voices into words, and the words into warnings from others who had been consumed before him, their thoughts now stitched into the fabric of the forest like moths trapped in amber, and they begged him, pleaded with him to resist, to fight, to sever the bond before the final transformation completed, because once the eye fully opened, once the skull merged completely, he would become the next beacon, the next bait, the next hunter masquerading as prey. And so Amir stumbled, clutching the skull with one hand and dragging himself toward the chapel with the other, the forest now furious, screaming, howling, distorting space and time in a desperate attempt to confuse him, throwing memories of his mother's voice, his childhood dog, his favorite songs all twisted and warped into hallucinations that tried to seduce him into surrender. But he pressed on, teeth clenched, vision swimming, limbs growing heavier as if filled with lead, and when he reached the broken chapel doors, he found the altar had changed now. It was a table of flesh, pulsing, breathing, veined with black roots, and upon it lay not just the journal, but a dagger made of bone, glowing faintly with the same energy that pulsed from the skull's eye. And he knew, without understanding how, that this was his only chance. The only moment in the infinite loop where choice still existed. The voices screamed at him to attend. The nun stepped into the chapel again, closer than ever, her cracked lips trembling with rage or sorrow or both, and the reaper raised its scythe, not in threat but in final judgment, and Amir raised the dagger aimed it at the skull, but his body refused. Some invisible force fought back, nerves twitching, muscles locking, fingers trembling with resistance not his own. And the eye in the skull now stared directly into his, and he saw everything. The origin of the forest,